we'll get started. Welcome to the second installment of the 2026 Winter Lecture Series. I'm really excited for this presentation and really excited for you all to be here. I'm Dr. Audrey Thorsted, the Director of Programming at the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, or HIML, HMML, as many people know it. If you're new to Himmel, we're an international organization based out of Minnesota. And over the last 60 years, our purpose has remained the same. We preserve and share the world's handwritten past to inspire a deeper understanding of our present and future. These handwritten books or manuscripts are clues that document what humans over thousands of years thought important enough to share. Therefore, Himmel photographs manuscripts all around the world so their contents can be made available for centuries to come. We place a special priority on manuscripts located in regions endangered by war, political instability, or other threats. Preservation begins through partnerships with local libraries, and these are agreements that allow Himmel to make digital images of the manuscripts in their collections. Digitization is done entirely through local teams to whom Himmel provides equipment, training, technical support, and payment for their work. We photograph everything in the collection because we don't know what might be significant or important in the future. Copies of the digital images are given to the libraries that hold the manuscripts, and then another copy comes to Himmel in Minnesota. Himmel then employs catalogers and other staff to ensure that the digital images of these manuscripts are identified, supported for long-term access, and made freely available to the public on our website. Scholars from all around the world visit Himmel both physically at our locations on the St. John's University campus and virtually in our reading room, which houses millions of photographs of manuscripts. This work is solely funded by donations and grants. Please consider donating to Himmel to help us continue the important work of preserving cultural heritage around the world. As Himmel celebrates 60 years of operation, this year's Winter Lecture Series turns inward to our wonderfully hardworking and incredibly talented team. Today you will hear about the extraordinary work done by our curators and catalogers that help to identify manuscripts in our digital collections. I'm delighted to introduce one of my brilliant colleagues whom you will hear from today. Dr. Josh Mugler joined Himmel in 2018 as the Associate Cataloger for Arabic and Syriac manuscripts. In 2020, he was promoted to the Curator of Islamic Manuscripts and a few years later became the Curator of Eastern Christian and Islamic manuscripts. Dr. Mugler holds degrees from Oklahoma Baptist University, Shawnee, and the Divinity School of Harvard. In 2019, he earned his PhD in Theological and Religious Studies from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. He has presented at numerous conferences across the U.S. and internationally, and he has published widely. Prior to joining Himmel, Mugler taught at Georgetown University and worked as an assistant to the Study of Religions and Civilization program, which promotes the exchange of U.S.-based and Moroccan-based scholars. At Himmel, Mugler catalogs Eastern Christian and Islamic manuscripts and leads a team of catalogers assigned to these collections. The team works collaboratively across religious and linguistic boundaries to discover connections through the manuscript heritage of these diverse communities. Before I turn it over to our speaker, one final bit of housekeeping. We will have time for questions at the end. Please feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A box at any point during or after the presentation. You can find the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Dr. Paul Naylor will be one of Himmel's brilliant catalogers, will be leading the Q&A session. So a huge shout out to Paul for your help today. We will get to as many questions as we can. Now, without further ado, welcome and thank you for joining us today. I hope you enjoy the presentation. Dr. Mugler, I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Audrey, for that kind introduction. And thank you to everyone for being here. It's really an honor to have such a good crowd here to hear some thoughts. And yeah, I'm excited about this presentation. I'm going to basically talk about four parts of the world where where Himmel has worked, where Himmel has photographed manuscripts, and that I have cataloged during my time with Himmel, and look at some places where cultural regions, manuscript cultures have been divided by modern borders, and just to think about the effects of those changes on some of these manuscript and post-manuscript cultures that where Himmel's work is happening today and has happened over the last 60 years. Um, so I want to start actually with this map, this hand-drawn manuscript map that was on the poster for this event. This map was drawn by Jacques Rétoré, who was a French Dominican missionary, died in 1921. Um, he uh, he was from central France. He ended up becoming a Dominican and heading off to join the mission that was based in Mosul, which you see towards the um, bottom center of the screen here. Mosul, of course, is in modern Iraq. Um, but Rhétoré traveled throughout this entire region that you see on this map. He became fluent in the vernacular Aramaic and Armenian languages of the Christians of this region, and wrote extensively in both of those languages as well as French. Um, and he worked to try and convince as many of these Christians as he could to become Catholics, more or less. What I think this map is really interesting. It's probably late 19th century, could be very early 20th century. I think this map is very interesting for the borders that you see on it and the borders that you don't. There, you can see the kind of thick dotted line going down the right side of the screen is the border between the Ottoman Empire and Iran. There's a little bit of the Russian Empire up at the top right. Um, but you do not see a border between what's now Turkey and Iraq or Syria to the south. Um, so you have this one kind of imperial border or two, but one is really important here. And then you have these kind of cultural religious groups that really you can see they cross that line pretty easily. Um, this is not exactly an ethnic map. It's really a map of religious groups, but there is a lot of overlap between those categories. And so you can see the key that Rhétoré wrote in the bottom left. You have the groups that he calls Nestorians in yellow, Chaldean Catholics in orange, Jacobites in green, dark green, Syriac Catholics, et cetera, et cetera. Um, Red is just Muslims in general. So there's no distinction ethnically between Turks, Arabs, Kurds, whatever other groups you'd like to mention. And you can see that some of the colors are a little faded. I think that a lot of what this looks like kind of background here is actually meant to be red. Um, and the green is also fairly faded. But you can see how complex this religious landscape was, especially considering that there are other complications that are not reflected in this map. Um, Yazidis are the dark red. That's where you see Mount Sinjar at the bottom, kind of darkly shaded in red, and then also a little bit to the right. Um, so you can see how these groups are all intermingling to quite an extent here. There's definitely not. It's not that the Ottoman Empire was some sort of paradise for everyone. It was an imperial project of its own. Uh, very negative effects on some groups. But for many centuries, it was a place where it would be completely normal to visit a town in this region and hear people speaking Turkish, Aramaic, Armenian, Kurdish, Arabic, maybe even Greek. Um, all of these groups were really brushing up against each other. And towards the end of its time, the empire became much more consumed by the sort of nationalist ideology that was spreading Europe at the time, and it really had disastrous effects on the ability of these various groups to live side by side. And of course, that's part of what we'll be talking about. Um, so you can see there's all these groups mixed up. They cross the border. They interact, across the borders that existed then and the ones that exist now. Um, this is he copied this. He drew this map into the front of this manuscript, which was written by him in both French and vernacular Aramaic. And it's basically a poem. It's nicely decorated. It's got all these little flowers on the title page, but it's basically a poem encouraging um, Assyrian mountain dwellers to become Catholics. Um, but just as some examples of things um, that were part of this larger cultural sphere when they were created, you have, this manuscript was copied in Mosul in Iraq, and now is in Mardin, Turkey. You have the opposite, of course. This was copied in Mardin, now is in Mosul. Um, you have examples like this where a single scribe, Ibrahim ibn Khidr, um, copied both of these manuscripts. He lived in what's now northern Iraq, um, mostly in Mosul, but the one on the right has ended up in Turkey in Midyat. The one on the left is still in Mosul. So there's definitely a sense that these things were produced in a kind of coherent cultural sphere that um, was not that where things could flow across what's now a border. And of course, with the outbreak of World War One, all of this changed. So I I begin here with a reference to Sarajevo as the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, but we'll come back to Sarajevo at the very end of the talk um, as an important place where Himmel is working today. Um, now, if when you think of World War One, depending on your own background, you may think mostly of, the trenches in France, all quiet on the Western Front, that kind of thing. But it really was a world war, and it really was something that affected what we think of as the Middle East very strongly. So this is a church register from Diyarbakir, Turkey, of a Chaldean Catholic church that is recording the names of the members of their own community who have died. And the entire manuscript is all in Arabic except for this one entry, which is in French, and it's mentioning a German officer who died in Diyarbakir in 1916. So World War One was very much powerfully felt by people in this region, just as strongly as it was in Western Europe. And then with the end of the war, uh, all of these things changed. The borders changed. You have from the same manuscript as before, you have Rhétoré describing what happened to the people of this mountain region where he was working. Um, he says, chased from their mountains by the Kurds, the Nestorians passed through Persia, then descended to Baquba near Baghdad, where they remained until the end of 1920. They returned to Mosul to try to find a habitable territory. But they had lost in exile and wars two-thirds of their nation, all their villages were ruined, and Kuchanis destroyed. Kuchanis was where their patriarchate was, up in the mountains. That was kind of the center of their cultural life before World War One. So you have this people who suddenly are chased from their homes. They flee across one border, back across another border. Um, they end up back in Mosul, which is fairly close to where they had lived before. But now things are divided. And it's interesting that he calls them a nation. There's questions swirling in the air of what is a nation and how do they exist in the world? What happens if they don't have a state? Should we give them a state? All these questions about orders and all these things. So this is at the end of Rhétoré's life, but he's still this kind of collapses the place that he's lived and worked for many decades at this point. Um, of course, with these genocides of the Armenians and Assyrians, many of the manuscripts, if they were not destroyed, they often went with people as refugees to wherever they could find a new home. So this is a 14th century Armenian manuscript that was copied on the shore of Lake Van. It's now in Aleppo, where it was photographed by Himmel, and that movement occurred at this time period as the Armenian community fled to anywhere that they could find um, something that seemed like a safe home. Um, so in this process, you have all of these new borders being created, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, but also in the Middle East. Um, this is really the golden age of the nation state. You know, there's this is the the project of Wilson. You know, a state for every nation and a nation for every state. Basically, that um, we're no longer living in a world of these multicultural empires, but instead we want a state for the Hungarians and a state for the Romanians and a state for the Poles and a state for the Turks. And so you have really massive projects taking place in this time period, such as the Greek Turkish population exchange in the 20s, where many thousands um, of Orthodox Christians are shipped out of Turkey to Greece. Almost as many Muslims are shipped out of Greece to Turkey, even if they don't know the language or have any sort of prior acquaintance with that region. That's considered to be their rightful place. The Turks belong on this side of the sea, Greeks belong on that side. Um, and so you have all these new lines being drawn, including some that cut through this region that we're talking about, this Upper Mesopotamian area from Rituray's map. And so now, of course, you have a border in that region. You have this infrastructure, this fence with a carefully controlled gate, militarized border zone, with the Turkish flag on one side and the flag of Kurdistan kind of eclipsing the Iraqi flag on the other side, which I'm sure plenty of people in Kurdistan would be perfectly happy with. But there's this in addition to the kind of raw infrastructure of this that makes it harder to go from one side to the other that maybe was more passable before. Um, you have the sense of the meaning of these symbols um, that Turkey is meant to be a state for the Turks, and Kurdistan is meant to represent the Kurds. Um, and so, what happens in this new structure? What happens to people who don't have a state? You know, there's this. You know, Jacques Touré describes the nation, as he calls it, of the Nestorians or the Assyrians, kind of fleeing from one place to another, and they eventually in the 20s and 30s fought to try to gain their own state, but they were suppressed and they ended up kind of scattered. And so there's a lot of questions of, how can you make sure that um, all of these different people and all of their cultural heritage is able to survive even in a world where it's impossible to kind of perfectly sort everyone into the proper nation state, the proper side of the border that they supposedly belong in. And so part of what we are able to do with our work at Himmel is to photograph these different manuscripts that are now on different sides of the border, bring them all together in a single repository online, and make them available to people on either side of that border, but also people who have been scattered because they no longer fit there, and so they've ended up. Many people from this region have ended up in Europe or America or Australia, and our digital collections help them to access that cultural heritage, even if it's difficult for them to travel to Turkey or Iraq or any of these other places. Um, so, so that's part of the reason why we do the kinds of work that we do. So from this border, we pass to a different border partitioned slightly later. Of course, this is the India and Pakistan. Um, and this is a map placed in August 1947. This is a map that appeared in a British newspaper in June 1947, so 2 months before the partition took place and these two countries became independent of British rule. Um, And I think what really strikes me about this map is how they really had no idea what was going to happen. This is literally 2 months before the partition. Um, and there are all these question marks. If this region decides on partition, then this other region will have to decide where they go. This map looks nothing like the map that actually came into existence later on. There's all these princely states that eventually got kind of swallowed up into India. There's the Punjab you can see here, which is no longer a single region, but is divided by the partition down the middle. Um, so, you know, we're talking about something, I mean, the partition of India cost millions of lives, and many more millions were forced to flee their homes. Hindus in Pakistan, Muslims in India, um, all were kind of on the move in a situation of extreme chaos and violence. And this is what the empire knew about it only 2 months before. So we're talking about a massive world event that completely reshaped the lives and destinies of so many people. And this is what we have. So um, we also we preserve evidence in some of our digitized manuscripts of the world before this. So this is a manuscript that was copied by a student from Pakistan who went to Deoband in India, which was one of the most prominent schools for Muslims in South Asia at the time, um, and copied this Arabic scholarly text, brought it back home to Faisalabad, Pakistan, in the Punjab. Um, there's text in vernacular languages like Punjabi. Um, the Punjab especially was this kind of smaller, coherent cultural region that is now cut down the middle with uh, different religious groups on either side of the border, different writing systems, different scholarly and cultural apparatus, and it's now quite difficult for them to even kind of communicate across that line. Um, we also have a text like this that testifies to the real religious complexity of South Asia. With This is a Hindu religious text, one of the Puranas, the Bhagavata Purana, and um, it's written here in the Arabic script, which is typically used by Muslims, but someone wanted to this text in their own alphabet, and it was written out in this lovely manuscript form. So, you get a sense of how people are exchanging ideas, exchanging textual traditions, not only across what are now national borders, but also what we think of as dividing lines between religious and cultural groups. There's so much conversation going on. And one major figure who was involved in this partition event was this Abdul Haq, also known as the father of Urdu, Baba Urdu. You can read more about him in a article that I wrote that's on our website. Um, but he was in charge of this large cultural institution called the Institute for the Study of for the Advancement of Urdu, which is actually the institution that holds this manuscript that I just showed you. Um, but the institute was based in Delhi, um, and at the time of partition, Abdul Haq was not able to get to his office for several months, and when he did, it had been ransacked in the violence of partition. He was able to recover many of the manuscripts, but there were definitely plenty that were missing, which is what he's describing here. He says, "When we did not find any precious book or manuscript, its missing status broke our heart. What sadness is due to those things when thousands, no hundreds of thousands of precious lives have been hunted down with such oppression and cruelty? In those torn pieces of waste paper, pieces of our heart can be found." So he describes the experience of coming back to his library and realizing how much of it had been lost, um, And he tried to continue bridging the divide between India and Pakistan over the next several years, but there was pressure really from both sides that he should, as a Muslim and as an Urdu representative, he should be based in Pakistan. And so he ended up finally relocating there with what was his personal possessions from the library, which include this manuscript, as well as thousands of others. The rest of the library was left in Delhi, um, and it became kind of two separate organizations for two separate nation states. Um, Now he did not want things to be limited in that way. He said, I wanted to work in both places, meaning India and Pakistan, rather even farther than this, in Afghanistan, Iran, China, Arabia, Indonesia, etc. The language and culture that are shared by most of the population of Pakistan and India should remain completely free. So he had this kind of pan-Asian vision where he was hoping to work across all of these borders and spread the kind of cultural riches of the Urdu tradition to anyone who was willing to listen. Um, but as it turned out, he ended up mostly confined in his later years to Pakistan because of the ongoing tensions between the countries. There was also this famous this photograph that became famous from the partition era of B.S. Kesavan, who became the National Librarian of India. And this is supposedly a photo of him trying to divide all of the books in one of the prominent libraries of South Asia between ones that would go to Pakistan and ones that would go to India. Now, Kesavan says in later texts, you know that this never happened. This was a sort of staged photograph by I believe, Life magazine photographer, but it kind of, I mean, the reason it never happened is because it's such a uh, farcical idea. The idea that you could go through one of these libraries and decide on some rational basis which one goes to which of these countries is just there's no way that you could possibly make that decision because they were just one region for until 1947. Um, so it's a staged photo that kind of shows how ridiculous some of these processes were, even as some libraries really did split, like Abdul Haq's. But on what basis can you really make that decision? Um, so we pass from South Asia to back to the Middle East, and then we have, of course, the some of the borders that I was already talking about, the new borders of French and British colonialism in the Middle East, which became the states that we have today. Um, they divided them up into these different regions, and then, of course, after World War II, there was a further attempt to partition the British Mandate of Palestine. So you have, again, this is a map from just a few months before the partition um, was attempted to go into effect. You have the proposed Jewish state in blue, the Arab state in orange, and then a kind of international neutral zone around Jerusalem. And of course, as you probably know, like the India-Pakistan partition map I showed earlier, this map looks basically nothing like what actually came into existence. So uh, after the War of Independence or and the Nakba of the next few years, what you ended up with was a significantly larger state of Israel and um, smaller Arab territories that were under the control of the neighboring states, and Jerusalem split right down the middle. And then, of course, the continuing changes of territory and control and power in that region over the ensuing decades. Um, but this was the attempt by the UN, or an attempt by the UN, to find a way to divide this up, to try to sort people into the proper zones where everyone could have a place where they belong, and no one should cross those lines. Um, this Uthman al-Qabba is a pretty interesting figure. He born in Ottoman Gaza and died in Egyptian Gaza in the years post Nakba. Um, and he wrote manuscript texts throughout his life, including this one that was written right at the very end. This is a text on the apocalypse, on the end of the world, and he wrote it in 1950 in Gaza. Um, I mean, he's experiencing these catastrophic changes. He's experiencing the Nakba firsthand. Um, and he says this question of Palestine will undoubtedly be the introduction to the great battles mentioned by the ancient texts, and these are their first signs. And to God all things return. So you can I mean, you can see why someone living through this would think it's the beginning of the end. It's the end of the world, and why there would be um, other people around who were talking about this sort of thing. You know, everything is kind of falling apart. Um, and but there are remnants of an earlier time where all of these uh, where this whole kind of Levantine region um, was a place where manuscripts and texts could spread. So we have this Christian Arabic text that was copied in Bethlehem and is now in Lebanon. Another Christian Arabic text was printed in that same monastery in Lebanon, but is now in Jerusalem. Um, this Islamic text was copied in 1402 in Tripoli, Lebanon, is now in Jerusalem. So all of these things kind of moved around as people moved around, as people shared and traded with each other. Um, there was a much freer kind of um, movement around the region in an earlier time period. We even have in Jerusalem, there's this um, 17th century text that kind of lays out, you know, what what the Holy Land means, what Palestine means, what Syria means, these kind of geographical ideas that you know this scholar is trying to um, provide some understanding of where exactly is Palestine, where does it begin and end, what are the description of the different cities. For example, this is the description of Gaza. Um, Describes it's by the sea. There's many trees and date palms, many orchards and farms, many fruits. It is among the best cities of Palestine. So this is the kind of this scholar is trying to um, kind of lay out like where exactly this region is and how it relates to kind of greater Syria, northern Lebanon, and all these things. Um, One of the libraries that Himmel has digitized the collection in Jerusalem is the Halaby Library, which is an old family library of a prominent Muslim scholarly family in Jerusalem. Um, but it opened as a library that was accessible to researchers from the public in 1900. We have this description by the founder, Al-Hajj Ragib al-Khalidi, who's on the right in this image. Um, but he describes how, to his mind, the people of the Middle East are kind of behind in a cultural sense, and they need to um, build libraries and study so that they can once again um, compete with the Europeans, who he says acquired wealth and power and took over all of these regions. Um, Now, this library was founded in this Ottoman time period where none of these borders were there. But then, of course, with the 1948, the 1967, um, new new borders have come into existence, have passed out of existence, have changed, um, and so now many of before 1967, many of the users of this library were coming from the West Bank or from Jordan or other places, and they could easily come into Jerusalem and access the manuscripts and print books in the library to study their heritage. Now, of course, there's a wall, and the things like the wall are interesting because they both are and are not borders. It's not. It doesn't follow the internationally recognized border. It doesn't provide much of a. It doesn't act as much of a barrier to new settlers coming in. to the West Bank, but it can be a very formidable barrier for anyone coming the other way, you know. Um, so this has cut off places like the Holiday Library from a lot of their potential user base in the West Bank and beyond. And so that's part of the reason why they, so happy to have things digitized so that they're accessible again across that border, but also to their community of people who many have been scattered to other parts of the world. Um, and so that's part of the project of the digitization is to make things available for people who can't get to the actual library. Um, and then, of course, with the most recent years of genocidal violence in Gaza, um, there are people like Hanin al-Amasi who are she's a scholar from Gaza, an archaeologist who is just now starting to dig out some of the manuscripts um, that were destroyed or damaged when these cultural institutions were attacked. Um, and so you can see, some of the books that she's been digging out of the rubble of the Great Omari Mosque in Gaza. Here, you can see this manuscript on the left picture with a hole blown through it. And this manuscript is actually here. This is a photo of it that's in Himmel's collection. And so you can see what it looked like before uh, it was it was attacked. Um, and so this is really, I mean, this is really why we do what we do. This is just a great example of there's always going to be some destructive powers out there um, that are causing danger to people's cultural heritage. But if we can create a digital record of things, then you can see what was there. And you can read what this book is, even if it's um, even if it's been damaged. It can't replace the original, of course, but it can provide access to what's there. Um, and so I'm it's a real honor to have some role in making these things available beyond this violence. So um, last area of the world that I want to talk about is the Balkans. Yugoslavia was the name of this region from the early 20th century to 1991-ish. And you can see how complex, again, just like some of the other regions we've been looking at, how complex this ethnic map is. And maybe nowhere more than in Bosnia and Herzegovina in the center here. Um, just so many different groups. And for a long time, especially with the longtime government of Tito and others, the Yugoslavia was able to kind of unite all of these different ethnic groups as South Slavs. That's what Yugoslavia means. That's the land of the South Slavs. Um, but eventually it collapsed, and the um, the borders were created here. The former Yugoslavia was divided into um, different states that were meant to approximate the different ethnic groups. But they, of course, as we've already said, they can't map exactly. You can't create perfect borders that sort everyone just into the exact place where they belong in a situation where you have so many different groups living alongside each other like this. And as a result, the 1990s saw very destructive wars throughout the Balkans, but especially in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Um, uh, Incredible violence broke out. Sarajevo was under siege for years. Um, Fairly early in that process, the National Library, which you see on the right here, well, actually in both pictures, the National Library um, was shelled by the Serbian forces that were laying siege to the city. And so the books and manuscripts there were destroyed as far as the army could do that. This poem is by someone who witnessed those events, Farida Durakovic, and she describes. Uh, she says, I also remember, that is, I see at this very moment, the bodies of books crackling on a hot August day in 1992 in golden flames of hatred. So there was an intentional attempt to wipe out as much of the Bosnian cultural heritage as possible um, by shelling the library. Um, Now, a number of people removed as many of those precious books as they could from the library before it was fully destroyed. The um, most memorable of these is Ida Berturovic, who she was a librarian there. She helped to remove the manuscripts and then was killed by a sniper on the way home. So we honor her memory for sure. And Then, in the wake of this, I also want to mention Andras Riedelmeyer, who just died earlier this month. This is him with his cat Gideon. He was a librarian at Harvard, and he worked in the 90s, in the kind of early days of the internet, to create an online repository for images of manuscripts from the National Library in Sarajevo. Um, really kind of pioneering some of the type of work that Himmel tries to do, so that there would be a record of these things. He collected as many images as he could. He traveled through these countries, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo, all of these places, collecting, documenting what had been done to the various cultural sites and items there. And then he testified at war crimes trials against some of the military leaders who had been carrying out these acts. And As I said, he just passed away earlier this month, so he will be missed. Um, but as a result of all this war, the country of Bosnia and Herzegovina was basically partitioned again, into the blue area for the Bosnians and the Republika Srpska for the Serbs in the pink. And so these two parts of the country continue to have a coexistence today, uh, with with all the tension you might expect, but they do exist in a single country, with some autonomy from each other. Um, so again, there's this attempt to, if we just kind of draw the right borders, then people will be in the right spot. Um, but so we have examples of manuscripts from an earlier time period that testify to the how much of this was kind of shared and spreading across all of these things that are now borders. This is a Persian manuscript that was copied in what's now Republika Srpska, which is now in Sarajevo. All these manuscripts I'll show you are in Sarajevo now, and they were saved by people like Ida Buturovic when the National Library was destroyed. Um, this is in Persian. So there, in addition to where they were copied, there's a real mix of just that just shows how much of this exchange was going on. Um, this is a Latin manuscript that was copied in Croatia, which is now in Sarajevo. An Arabic manuscript copied in Belgrade in Serbia. A Turkish manuscript copied in Montenegro. And lastly, a manuscript in Bosnian in the Slavic vernacular, which was copied in Kosovo in 1939. Um, all those are in Sarajevo now. If you went to libraries in the other countries of the region, you would find a similar thing. You would find manuscripts or books that were from all these different places that have now ended up in those countries. So there's this kind of wide-ranging cultural zone that was there before, and then there's been attempts to contain it in the present. So um, I'm about out of time, and I want to close by just asking what do borders do, um, and what happens when people or books or other cultural objects are end up on the wrong side of them. I know that this is a question that my colleagues in Minnesota have been thinking about nonstop for the last few weeks and months. But I think this is all a question about what kind of world are we trying to create, and um, how can how can people and their cultural heritage be respected and sustained across all of those lines. And so I'll close with that. Um, and I'm excited to hear your questions.
Yeah, Josh, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you so much for a really informative and very emotive presentation on shifting borders and nations and how it's reflected in all of these written texts that you shared, but equally importantly, in where these documents are located today. And you can see how Josh's work, really serves to bring these documents back into conversation with each other and through our website, VHML, also to make them accessible to everybody, no matter where they might be located. So my name is Paul Naylor. I'm a cataloger of West African manuscripts here at HEML, and as colleagues, we don't often get the opportunity to hear about each other's work in this much detail. So this has been great in many ways. So I believe it now falls to me to open the floor to questions from all of you. So please type your questions into the Q&A box, and I will read them out loud. And as Audrey mentioned at the beginning, we'll try to get through as many of these questions today as we can. So I already have a couple of them. Um, how do you discover, how have you made interesting discoveries about collections that were physically separate and have now been unified? How do you know that they belong together through your work at Himmel?
Yeah, well, it's always helpful when the scribe of the manuscript tells you something about where it was produced or for whom or in what setting. Um, and then sometimes you can trace the history of a manuscript through notes, different owners over the centuries, different repositories that it's been part of, stamps and notes that are meant to mark some of that history. Um, and then occasionally there are like explicitly composite collections that really testify in their structure to some of that history. So, for example, in Aleppo, we digitized a the collection of the Syriac Orthodox Archdiocese of Aleppo, and uh, all of the shelf marks, the labels, the numbers of the manuscripts in that collection include a kind of one or two letter code that tells you which prior collection they came from, because this is one of those collections that was um, reshaped by the arrival of numerous refugees from the Assyrian genocide in Turkey. And so many of the manuscripts in that collection ended up um, in Aleppo that were previously in what's now Turkey. Um, so there are a variety of ways that you can get a sense of these things. Sometimes you have like the example I showed where it's a single scribe. They've ended up in different places. Um, so there's all sorts of things that give you a sense um, of where they came from and how they might be connected to each other. Right? We have um, in our reading room we have a place of origin field where you can search for things that were produced in Syria but are now in Turkey or vice versa or whatever it is. So there's all sorts uh, of interesting connections that you can pull out.
That was another question. How might we search for this material on Reading Room? Collections that are now separated geographically. Any tips on how
Mhm.
to isolate these in VHML searches and the like?
Yeah, well, it kind of depends on which particular area of the world you're talking about. I mean, most of what I was talking about in this, with some exceptions, like in India, Pakistan with Abdul Haq and his library, most of these collections were not kind of a single library that was separated, but rather examples of a much larger kind of cultural sphere that has now been separated. So um, you can look for in the place of origin field, you can put in like I want to see manuscripts that were produced in Diyarbakir or in Turkey generally,
Mhm.
and then say I want to see the ones that are now in Iraq, uh, and that will give you a list of examples. Um, but you kind of have to look around with different regions.
And I have another question here about about empire specifically.
Mhm.
We and your presentation was mostly about the impact of borders on people in terms of modern day borders created through the era of nation states. But could you talk a little bit about empire and the impact of empire on people, but also on manuscripts specifically, and cultural heritage more generally?
Yeah, yeah. Well, like I said at the beginning, the just as an example, the Ottoman Empire was where many of these manuscripts came from, whether in Mesopotamia or Palestine or Bosnia. Um, and the Ottoman Empire was not some sort of, paradise, uh, but but like all pre-modern empires, it was uh, understood to be multi-ethnic. When you expand your borders in the way that an empire does, um, especially in the pre-modern period, you can't try to impose this sort of ethnic uniformity on places as far flung as Bosnia and Iraq. But so in that sense, it was normal to have multilingual communities, multi-religious communities, multi-ethnic communities, even as there was frequently some tension between them. Um, Now the empire also creates particular networks of scholarly exchange. So I showed examples of manuscripts that are in Sarajevo that were produced in various parts of the former Yugoslavia, but uh, at least as many manuscripts in Bosnia were produced in Turkey because that was the imperial core and that was where people from Bosnia would go to study and they would produce manuscripts and they would bring them back. Um, so you get these kind of like centralizing, but also um, you know peripheralizing forces where Bosnia becomes this place that's kind of on the edge of the empire, and then people are constantly going off to Istanbul or other scholarly centers in Anatolia to access that knowledge.
Yeah, I got questions coming in fast now. So are there any examples of historical conversations across partition through previous trade routes, etc., that can be seen in materials in Hemel Reading Room that are now separate? So highlighting the interaction between communities that are now divided along modern political lines. Just any examples that come to mind.
Yeah, well, I think that the examples that I share were some of the ones that I had come across, but certainly there are many more examples of um, the interactions between what's now Iraq and Syria and Turkey, for example. That um, this was this was a place where it was fairly normal uh, to interact across what's now these modern lines. So yeah, I think that there are many examples to be found in the
Mhm.
collections.
And on a related point now, a question about translation. And I know you presented on multilingual manuscripts before, but one thing you maybe didn't mention was translation. And so, can you give some example on how texts from outside areas or different cultural contexts were translated into local languages, whether classical or whether maybe more classical languages?
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, that's an interesting question, and it really provides a yeah, a fascinating sort of counterpart to um, the question of like ethnic groups and borders. I mean, there are numerous examples of texts that have been translated. For example, we have a lot of things that were translated from Arabic or Persian into Turkish and were copied in the Ottoman Empire in Turkish, or sometimes rather than a direct translation, there would be um, a commentary where you copy the core text in Arabic or Persian and then write a commentary in Turkish to help people understand it. Um, Now, what's less common but becomes more and more common in the modern period is translations into actual vernacular languages like Bosnian. You know, you get a lot of translations into Turkish because it becomes its own imperial language. And so people from all corners of the empire are accessing it um, in in that imperial language. So if someone from Bosnia in the 17th century wanted to learn to access like the Islamic scholarly tradition, they would need to know um, Arabic and really Turkish as well. I mean, they would need to learn at least Turkish and probably Arabic. Um, but eventually, you get more and more text in the vernacular to make it accessible um, to people. You know, things like catechisms and poems and things that are meant to be accessible for just regular people. Um, but there is a lot of translation, but it's also less than you might expect just because people would access so much scholarly literature in like classical, sacred, imperial languages that were more widespread: Arabic, Turkish, Persian, Syriac in Christian tradition, um, for
Yeah,
example.
thank you. I think that's all the questions we have time for. I will hand back over to Audrey to conclude.
Perfect. Thank you to Josh for the presentation and Paul for hosting the Q&A session. Josh, I think your presentation raises a lot of questions that many of us are thinking about and facing sort of every day, questions about borders and who belongs where and who gets to say that. So thank you everyone for joining for our second installment of the 2026 Winter Lecture Series. I hope you'll join us next time. It will be on March 25th in 4 weeks, same time, same place. With another one of Himmel's curators, Dr. Matthew Heinzelman, who is the curator of our Western European manuscripts and special collections. So we're going to hear a little bit more about partnerships and how they are sort of the foundation of Himmel's work over the last 60 years. Again, the lecture is free, but you need to register in order to get the Zoom link, so I would encourage you to do that. And then finally, one bit of housekeeping. When you exit this Zoom webinar, you will be prompted to take a very short survey. Please fill this out. It helps us create programming for you. So thank you once again to our presenter, our Q&A host, and everyone who joined us today. I hope we will see you soon at our next event.